For decades, Melissa Gilbert and Patty Duke were names that symbolized everything wholesome and inspiring about television's golden age. One was the beloved face of Little House on the Prairie, and the other, an Academy Award-winning actress who conquered both movies and personal demons. But behind the smiles and the polished public image, there was a complex, emotional bond, one that shaped Melissa's life in ways she never truly revealed. Until now. At 61, Melissa Gilbert is finally ready to speak about her relationship with Patty Duke, the woman who wasn't just a friend or mentor, but a mirror reflecting both the beauty and darkness of fame. Their connection went far deeper than fans ever knew, touching on love, pain, and the shared struggle of surviving Hollywood's pressures as young women. When they met, Melissa saw Patty as a force of nature, brilliant, unpredictable, and brave. But behind that brilliance, Patty was fighting battles that the world couldn't see. As years passed, Melissa would come to understand the price of talent, the weight of fame, and the scars that never fully heal. Now, after years of silence, Gilbert's reflections bring new light to a friendship forged in the fire of Hollywood and tested by time, tragedy, and truth. This is the story of two remarkable women, bound by art, haunted by pain, and united by the courage to finally tell it all. Long before the world knew them as two of television's most beloved women, Melissa Gilbert and Patty Duke were simply two child actors navigating a world that demanded perfection from its youngest stars. Their stories ran parallel for years, two girls growing up under hot studio lights, their innocence traded for applause. But when their paths finally crossed, it was as if they recognized something in each other that few others could understand. Patty Duke had already lived through the kind of fame most could only dream of, and fear. By the time Melissa Gilbert was born in 1964, Patty had already won an Academy Award for The Miracle Worker and starred in her own television show, The Patty Duke Show. She had survived the manipulations of a controlling studio system, a turbulent family life, and a public struggle with mental illness. To the world, she was a success story, but to those close to her, Patty was a survivor. Melissa, on the other hand, was just beginning her rise. Discovered as a young girl with a natural charm, she became America's sweetheart through her role as Laura Ingalls Wilder in Little House on the Prairie. Audiences fell in love with her freckled face and fierce spirit, unaware of the real-life pressures behind that smile. Fame came fast, but childhood slipped away even faster. When Melissa met Patty Duke years later, she was already aware of Patty's reputation, talented, outspoken, but deeply complicated. The first time they spoke, Melissa later recalled feeling an immediate connection. "She saw through me," Melissa once said. Not as the actress, but as a young woman trying to make sense of her own life in Hollywood. Their bond formed quickly, rooted in shared experience. Patty became something of a mentor, a guiding light for Melissa, who admired her honesty and courage. Patty didn't hide her struggles. She spoke openly about her battles with bipolar disorder, her unstable upbringing, and the mistakes that haunted her. To Melissa, that honesty was revolutionary. In a town that celebrated image over truth, Patty Duke dared to be real. In those early years of friendship, Melissa learned from Patty that vulnerability wasn't weakness, it was strength. They spent hours talking about work, love, and the impossible expectations placed on women in Hollywood. Patty often reminded Melissa not to lose herself in the industry's illusions. "They'll tell you who to be," she once warned, "but you've got to know who you are before they do." At the time, Melissa was struggling to define that very thing. She was transitioning from child star to adult actress, facing the same judgment and pressure that had nearly destroyed Patty years before. Watching Patty live unapologetically, sometimes chaotically, but always authentically, gave Melissa courage. Still, there were moments of heartbreak. Patty's emotional instability sometimes frightened Melissa, who was young and unsure of how to help. But through it all, the affection between them remained real. It wasn't a perfect friendship. It was raw, unpredictable, and deeply human. Over the years, as both women matured, their connection evolved. Melissa began to see Patty not as an icon, but as a person, flawed, passionate, and endlessly inspiring. And as Patty's life became more turbulent, Melissa found herself torn between admiration and concern. Little did she know the lessons she was learning from Patty Duke about resilience, forgiveness, and truth would one day become the foundation of her own strength. Their friendship wasn't just born out of fame. It was born out of understanding. Two women who saw in each other the reflection of everything they'd survived, and everything they still hoped to become. By the time Melissa Gilbert truly got to know Patty Duke, she understood one truth about Hollywood. The spotlight doesn't just illuminate, it exposes. Behind the laughter, the applause, and the flashing cameras, Patty carried a storm inside her, one that would both inspire and terrify those who loved her most. Patty Duke had always been a survivor. She rose from an abusive childhood and a controlling management team who dictated every move she made. As a child, she was molded into a product, her innocence marketed, her emotions manipulated. When she finally broke free, she found herself confronting the lifelong wounds of exploitation and trauma. By the time Melissa Gilbert came into her life, Patty had already endured decades of emotional highs and devastating lows. Melissa saw the charm and the chaos that coexisted in Patty. On her good days, she was magnetic, funny, fiercely intelligent and nurturing. She could command a room with a single laugh and uplift everyone around her. But on her darker days, she withdrew into herself, consumed by depression, self-doubt, and the lingering effects of bipolar disorder. For Melissa, who was still finding her footing in adulthood, witnessing Patty's vulnerability was both heartbreaking and enlightening. In interviews years later, Melissa would speak with compassion about Patty's struggles, calling her a woman who lived her truth, even when it cost her everything. That honesty became a compass for Melissa, who had grown up in an industry that rewarded silence and punished authenticity. Watching Patty refuse to hide her pain taught Melissa that real strength wasn't about being perfect. It was about surviving imperfection. Still, their friendship wasn't easy. There were moments when Patty's volatility pushed Melissa away. There were long stretches of silence, misunderstandings, and emotional distance. Yet no matter how far they drifted, there was always an unspoken connection, the kind that can only exist between two people who have seen each other's most unguarded selves. During the late 1980s and early 1990s, both women faced major turning points. Patty's career entered a quieter phase as she focused on advocacy and mental health awareness. Melissa, meanwhile, was entering the next act of her own life, transitioning from America's favorite girl next door to a confident woman and mother. But even as their careers diverged, Patty remained a quiet influence in Melissa's heart. Melissa often credited Patty with teaching her about self-acceptance. "She taught me not to be afraid of my flaws," Melissa once said. "That's something Hollywood doesn't teach you, but Patty did." Yet watching Patty struggle also made Melissa confront her own fears. The unpredictability of the business, the emotional isolation, the constant pressure to be perfect, all of it echoed through her own experiences. There were times Melissa wondered if the same system that broke so many others would eventually break her too. Through it all, Patty Duke remained a symbol of both warning and wisdom. She represented the cost of fame, the toll it takes on one's soul when the world demands your best while ignoring your pain. But she also represented redemption, the ability to rise, fall, and rise again. Their friendship wasn't about gossip or glamour. It was about survival. They didn't see each other as competitors, but as kindred spirits who had both lost parts of themselves to an industry that demanded everything. By the time Patty began to slow down, her legacy had already touched Melissa in profound ways. She had shown her that it was possible to live honestly, to speak openly about trauma, to fight for mental health awareness, and to find peace even in the midst of chaos. What Melissa didn't know then was that Patty's greatest lesson was still to come, one that would emerge not in life, but in the quiet, emotional aftermath of her passing. When the world learned of Patty Duke's passing on March 29, 2016, the news struck with the quiet ache of losing someone who had been part of our collective memory for generations. For Melissa Gilbert, the loss was personal, a grief that felt deeper than words could express. Patty wasn't just another Hollywood figure. She was a living reminder of what it meant to be both gifted and wounded, strong and fragile. Melissa described feeling as though a chapter of her own life had closed forever. Patty had been one of the few people who truly understood the contradictions of fame, the loneliness that lurked behind the red carpets, the pressure to stay perfect, and the longing to be seen not as a character, but as a person. Losing her felt like losing a mirror to her own story. In the days that followed Patty's death, tributes poured in from across the industry. Co-stars, directors, and fans celebrated her brilliance, her courage in discussing mental health, and she remembered the private conversations, the laughter over late-night phone calls, and the raw honesty that had defined their friendship. Melissa later revealed that Patty's death forced her to reflect deeply on her own life. "She taught me so much about truth," Melissa shared in a heartfelt interview. "But I didn't realize until she was gone how much I had taken from her. The courage to live authentically, to stop pretending, to forgive myself." After Patty's passing, Melissa revisited old photos and letters, reminders of a friendship that had endured highs and lows, silence and reconciliation. Patty's handwriting, full of emotion and personality, brought tears to her eyes. Each note reminded her of the woman who had once told her, "Don't let them take your light, kid. It's yours. Protect it." As Melissa reflected, she realized how much Patty's life had been both a warning and a gift. Patty had faced her demons head-on: addiction, mental illness, failed relationships. Yet she always found a way to keep going. She had stumbled, but she had also triumphed. In her final years, she found peace in advocacy, love in her marriage to Michael Pierce, and purpose in her openness about mental health. For Melissa, who had also faced her own public struggles, from divorce to burnout to redefining her identity after fame, Patty's story became a guiding light. It reminded her that redemption isn't about erasing the past, it's about accepting it. After Patty's death, Melissa made a promise to herself to live with the kind of honesty that Patty had fought for. She began to speak more openly about her own battles, about aging in Hollywood, about mental health, and about the unrealistic expectations placed on women in the industry. In doing so, she felt closer to Patty than ever. One of the most emotional moments for Melissa came when she attended a private memorial held by Patty's family and close friends. As people shared stories of her humor, her generosity, her fire, Melissa sat quietly, tears streaming down her face. "I realized then," she would later say, "that Patty had given so much of herself to the world, and somehow she had given the same to me." Patty Duke's passing wasn't just the end of a friendship. It was a turning point for Melissa Gilbert, the moment she truly understood the importance of using her voice, not just for acting, but for truth. In losing Patty, Melissa found a new purpose: to carry forward her friend's legacy of openness, honesty, and resilience. The pain of goodbye became the spark that reignited her own fight to live authentically, both as a woman and as an artist. At 61, Melissa Gilbert stands as a woman transformed, no longer the wide-eyed child star of Little House on the Prairie, no longer the Hollywood ingenue shaped by others' expectations. Today, she's a voice of reflection, authenticity, and truth. And as she looks back on her journey, one name still echoes through every memory of struggle, survival, and grace: Patty Duke. In interviews and her own writings, Melissa finally began opening up about what Patty truly meant to her. Not just as a friend or a mentor, but as a soul companion, someone who understood her without explanation. "Patty was the first person who told me it was okay not to be okay," Melissa said softly. "She made me feel human again." For years, Melissa had carried fragments of Patty's influence in silence. But turning 61 changed something in her. Life had slowed down. Fame no longer defined her. She was living peacefully in upstate New York, surrounded by nature, working with her hands, far removed from the noise of Hollywood. It was in that quiet that she felt Patty's presence most. Gilbert began speaking about the pressure young actresses faced in the industry, the masks they were forced to wear, the impossible standards, and how that pressure often led to mental and emotional collapse. She pointed to Patty's story as both a warning and a beacon. She showed us what happens when the industry forgets that actors are human beings, but she also showed us how to fight back with honesty. Melissa's truth wasn't just about the past. It was about understanding the woman she had become. She talked openly about aging, about letting go of Hollywood's illusions, and about the quiet power of authenticity. Lessons Patty had modeled long before anyone was ready to listen. She was so brave, Melissa reflected. Patty didn't hide her illness, her mistakes, or her pain. She turned them into lessons. She was ahead of her time. As Gilbert's voice trembled, recalling her mentor, she spoke of the final message she hoped to pass on, the same message Patty had once given her. Be kind to yourself. Be honest about who you are, and never let fear silence you. Those words, once whispered in confidence between two women navigating fame's fragile terrain, had now become Melissa's mission to share with others. Her truth wasn't sensational. It was soulful. There were no scandals, no betrayals, no regrets, only gratitude. Gratitude for the woman who taught her resilience, for the bond that transcended fame, and for the reminder that even broken people can leave behind light. Melissa's revelation also served a greater purpose, to honor Patty's courage in talking about mental health long before it was accepted. In an era when silence was safer, Patty spoke up about bipolar disorder, about trauma, about recovery. Now, decades later, Melissa continued that legacy, using her own platform to advocate for honesty, healing, and the power of connection. Patty taught me that surviving isn't the same as living, Melissa said. You have to love yourself enough to tell the truth even when it hurts. That's what I'm doing now. At 61, Melissa's words resonate not just as an actress reflecting on a mentor, but as a woman who has made peace with herself. She's no longer chasing perfection. She's embracing truth, the same truth Patty once urged her to find. In the final moments of her tribute, Melissa looked to the sky, smiling softly. I like to think she's still out there somewhere, she said, probably watching me and saying, See? I told you you'd be okay. And perhaps, in that quiet moment, the truth Melissa Gilbert finally told wasn't just about Patty Duke. It was about herself. The little girl who grew up under the bright lights. The woman who stumbled. The friend who learned to forgive. And the soul who found peace in telling her story at last.